The following reflections are a workshop report from Sub-Project 1, Ornamental Constellations, on the Aesthetics of Literary Magazines in the Realm of Modern Mass Media of the DFG Research Unit, Journal Literature. I will briefly present a selected case study of the literary magazine Blätter für Kunst, Papers for Art, founded by the German poet Stefan George and edited by Carl August Klein between 1892 and 1919. This case study seems particularly instructive in the context of the conference and its central questions about the positioning of periodicals on the international market and the associated transfer, especially with regard to theoretic concepts and analytical methods of modernism research and periodical studies in connection with the little magazine as a world form. For the paradoxical market strategies of die Blätter für Kunst open up virulent questions about the definition of this magazine format, its ambivalent relationships to the print media mass market, the form of the international networks and transfer and translation, as well as transformation processes associated with it. Die Blätter für Kunst present themselves with the typical posture of a little magazine by positioning themselves emphatically outside of the commercial print market in differentiation from popular magazine formats and orienting themselves on international format models of the Petite Revue. Yet the concrete appearance of the magazine is quite irregular, or in Mark Turner's term, unruly. Not only does it appear at highly irregular frequencies, but it also oscillates between the booklet and book format in terms of form and between magazine and anthology in terms of content. Especially in the first publication phase from 1892 to 1898, on which I will focus largely to the time constraints, translations of canonical authors of international symbolism are a central component. In this context, the impression of national remoteness from the market and exclusivity is created not least through simultaneous international dissemination and networking as symbolic capital. At the same time, however, the inscription in the international movement of symbolism is accompanied by its transformation into a transnational nationalism that seeks to initiate the rebirth of the German nation out of the timeless aesthetic. The presentation is accordingly divided into the following three parts. Die Blätter für Kunst are initially self-published by Carl August Klein in collaboration with the small Berlin printing house Friedrich Synnabon. They are financed proportionally by the contributors who are not paid any author's fees. The title page of the first issue contains the notice: "This magazine, published by the editor, has a closed circle of readers invited by the members." This suggests the exclusivity of an elite exchange of like-minded artists far removed from the market. At the same time, however, there is a reference to the display in selected bookshops in European metropolises. Bear's bookshop in Berlin, Leopold Weiss in Vienna, and Léon Vanier in Paris. Vanier was a central promoter and publisher of French symbolism, and his bookshop was also a literary salon, which makes it clear that the magazine was from the beginning very much on the international market. From the third issue of 1893 onwards, Litera's art saloon in Munich appears instead of Vanier's bookshop, and in 1894 there is a reference in the Allgemeine Kunstchronik to the magazine display there and the possibility of purchasing it for 1 mark per volume. The price half-year is subsequently 3 to 4.5 mark, but even though the network of bookshops expands, and from the fifth episode in 1898, the Otto von Holten printing company finally takes over distribution for the Georg Bondi publishing house in Berlin, the magazine itself never becomes a commercially successful enterprise. Regarding the dual strategy of oscillating between exclusivity and publicity documented on the cover, researchers described the magazine as, quote, semi-public commodity, which on the one hand has the, quote, character of manifesto circulating with in the group, but on the other hand makes an effort to use the subversive, quote, concept of counter-publicity as legitimizing structure of journalistic strategies, in which, quote, the withdrawal from the market ultimately proves to be a gap in the market. The concrete appearance of the magazine up to 1919 was highly irregular and varied between the booklet and the book format. The first 4 series appear not least due to a lack of contributions at rather irregular intervals in 5 octavo-sized booklets called volumes, each with 32 pages. These are bound together in a book format with an overall table of contents contained in the 5th volume and are designed from the outset as one complete work. From the 5th episode onwards, the magazine is published only once a year in book format, with 156 pages. Then the intervals become even more irregular, and the last 2 episodes are even presented in 1919 in a single 320-page volume, which illustrates the magazine's becoming work-like. Just like the fact that in the last 3 episodes the contributors remain anonymous, suggesting collective authorship. The average circulation is 300 copies, with the last double episode reaching a circulation peak of 1,000 to 2,000 copies, including reprints. In addition, the magazine was joined by a self-publishing company from the end of 1894, which used the title of the magazine as a brand name and was later retained by Bondi as an imprint publishing house. From then on, it served as a public publication platform for the permanent circle that was consolidating itself out of the loose artists community. There, under a monstrance signet, designed by Melchior Lechter, primarily George's poetry and that of his companions and pupils, appears in the series Werke der Dichtung aus dem Kreis der Blätter für die Kunst, Works of Art from the Circle of the Papers for Art. Later, this is supplemented by the complementary scientific book series Werke der Wissenschaft aus dem Kreise der Blätter für die Kunst, Works of Science from the Circle of the Papers for Art, which mostly appears under the alternative Swastika signet. With the Jahrbuch für die geistige Bewegung, the Yearbook for the Intellectual Movement, edited by Friedrich Wolters and Friedrich Gundolf between 1910 and 1912, the publishing house also published another magazine with essayistic contributions and cultural critical orientation, which supplemented and temporarily replaced die Blätter für die Kunst as the publication organ of George's Circle. In addition, there are also a total of 3 anthological selection volumes from the Blätter für die Kunst themselves, which prepare them in a somewhat larger edition for a wider audience, as well as the 2-volume edition Contemporary Artists, Transcriptions, which also contains a selection of George's translations of European symbolists from die Blätter für die Kunst. In order to establish a national tradition, these anthology formats, which emerged from the magazine, were complemented by the 3-volume anthology Deutsche Dichtung, German Poetry, edited by George and Carl Wolfskehl. Thus, die Blätter für die Kunst proved to be a special periodical format that is difficult to define and extremely versatile throughout the entire period of publication. Moreover, through the affiliated self-publishing, respectively imprint publishing house, they produce another periodical and various anthologies under their brand name, in addition to the 2 series of literary and scientific works in book format. The symbolic capital generated by the paradoxical market strategies of the semi-public, non-market and non-commercial little magazine is thus the basis for an exclusive publishing brand on the commercial book market, whose publication network and cross-marketing strategies will have to be considered in more detail. This symbolic capital, however, is based primarily on the international transfer of the generic format Petit Revue, little magazine, and the corresponding formal and content-related networking of the special format Blätter für die Kunst with its international format models. But it's generated not least by their marketing in the form of announcement, reviews, and portraits of the magazine and its authors in these periodicals themselves, as well as in large number of other daily and weekly newspapers and popular magazines. Fundamental to transfer and networking were Stefan George's trips to England and France in the years 1888 to 1890, during which he took part in the regular Tuesday meetings at Stefan Mallarmé's salon in Paris, and the soirées organized by the editor-in-chief of La Plume, Léon Deschamps, and thus established contacts with leading representatives of symbolism, some of whom were also editors and contributors to magazines. Among them, for instance, was Albert St. Paul, who was a contributor to Irregular, L'Hermitage, and the Liège magazine La Wallonie, currently the leading organ of symbolism. He brought George in contact with its editor-in-chief, Albert Mockel, who gave the young German poet access to the networks of Belgian and Dutch symbolism. This is also included Paul Gerardi, who after the end of La Wallonie directed its successor organ Floréal in Ghent. At the same time, he became a contributor to Blätter für die Kunst. These symbolists, quote, little literary magazines as a form of publication of a both poetic and ideological community of mind, which the Mercure de France collaborator Rémy de Gaumont shortly afterwards assigned to the format of the Petite Revue, became models for the Blätter für die Kunst. They took over the title from Irregular. The layout of the title page is based on La Plume and other magazines, and the letter cover by Theodor Heine is quite similar in style to that of L'Hermitage and La Plume. The news section at the end of the magazines, which informs about the activities of related magazines, was also taken over from them and used not only for mutual networking, but above all for advertising purposes, whereby the names of the French and Belgian magazines also serve typographically as an effective advertising flagship. The decision in favor of the plain antiqua and grotesque fonts common in these format models should also be seen in this context, which goes hand in hand with the rejection of Gothic print as the so-called German typeface common in popular German magazines, and also documents the European orientation of die Blätter für die Kunst typographically. This becomes clear, for example, in Klein's contribution on Das doch nicht äußerliche, the yet not external. There he states in the introduction that even for the technical aspects of a book production, it is the author who is responsible, who claims for his creature a clothing befitting its status. This typographical decision and the simultaneous characteristic consistent use of lowercase, reduced punctuation, and simplified spelling is thus accompanied by a double gain in distinction on the German market that illustrates how die Blätter für die Kunst, by connecting to the French language magazines by means of format transfer, at the same time transforms this format and appears on the German market with an absolute claim to originality. He criticized, quote, arbitrary, unpleasant typography with a jumble of 9 different, all inharmonious marker fonts, decorated with the modest fleurons from the typesetting box of a trivial printer, must also be considered again in the context of the French format models, because here too there are great similarities. A comparative study of the concrete use of the different typefaces in the booklets is still pending. It needs to be examined whether thematic and stylistic differentiation and demarcation of the individual contributions by means of typography could be the background to the stated arbitrariness of the Harvard fonts. Quite in the sense in which the magazine Pan, once qualified by George as an imitation of die Blätter für die Kunst, states that a magazine is a house with many rooms and compartments whose rooms are to be furnished according to the desire and nature of those who dwell in them. This is at least indicated by the only recourse to a kind of Gothic print in the Blätter für die Kunst in the heading for the publication of Wolf Kehl's poems from the Heroic Ornaments, which is obviously based on a correspondence between typographical form and content. All in all, it seems reasonable to assume that the symbolist magazines developed a flexible practice of affiliation by design parallel to the Dada grid elaborated by Eric Bolson, which is reflected in an identifiable typographical style and in covers, in page layouts, and through printing techniques and the choice of materials. The affiliation with the French language format models is also reflected in a large number of promotional advertisements, reviews, and portraits of magazine and authors, which also involve other French, Belgian, Dutch, Scandinavian, and also German daily and weekly newspapers and popular magazines. Within the framework of an international symbolist coterie littéraire, these were largely based on the use of personal intermediaries. This secondary form of publicity came about partly through George's personal context or through the paper's staff and their acquaintances, e.g. when Klein himself published the article La littérature allemande contemporaine, with a reference to the Blätter für die Kunst in l'Ermitage in 1892, in which it appeared a little later, modified under the title Stefan George, a New Art. In 1893, he wrote a letter from Berlin to La Plume, in which he complained about the fact that Germany did not yet have a so-called Petite Revue in order to advertise the Blätter für die Kunst as such at the end. That this form of public relation was also the product of hearsay in connection with the passing on or acquisition of the magazine is made clear by the fact that for Johannes Jorgensen, Klein's contributions to l'Ermitage and La Plume served as sources for his article Stefan George, published in the Norwegian magazine Samtiden in 1893, in which some of George's poems are also printed in translation. Paradoxically, through a small positive contribution by Stéphane Mallarmé that was printed simultaneously in the Mercure de France and the Neue Deutsche Rundschau New German Review in 1895, die Blätter für die Kunst made early inroads into the opposing German paper which had emerged from the nationalism that it positioned itself against. Otherwise, there was only negative reporting there later, which nevertheless contributed to the paper's notoriety, for, as is well known, even bad publicity is good publicity. Decisive for the public impact of the magazine in Germany, however, were above all two publications arranged by the contributors to the magazine. On the one hand, the two special issues of the Allgemeine Kunstchronik of November 1894 and February 1895, initiated by Carl August Klein and Paul Girardi through Georg Fuchs. In addition to theoretical essays by Girardi and Wolfskehl, excerpts from works by George, Hofmannsthal and Girardi, as well as transcriptions of symbolist poets from the Blätter für die Kunst and a report by the Belgian on Walloon poets, an explanatory missive by Klein appeared in these, which offered the movement of the Blätter für die Kunst a space of public self-expression. On the other hand, the lecture Ein neuer Dichterkreis, a new circle of poets by the literary scholar Richard Moritz Meyer, which was initiated by Wolfskehl. This lecture was not only published in 1897 in the Preußische Jahrbücher, Prussian yearbooks, and was also summarized in the Deutsche Literaturzeitung, German literature newspaper, and die Vossische Zeitung, Vossian newspaper, but was even published by Bondi in booklet form and finally added to the first selection from the Blätter für die Kunst in 1898 as an explanatory reprint. In addition to the former transfer of the Petite Revue and the international print media networking with the corresponding symbolist periodicals, the content of the magazine was also characterized by a transfer of international symbolism, which was simultaneously transformed into a German transnational nationalism. The paradoxical structure of this transfer is already made clear by the program that precedes the first volume. The name of this publication already gives some indication of what it aims at. serving art, particularly poetry and literature, excluding anything concerning the state and society. It strives for spiritual art, based on a new way of feeling and creating, an art for its own sake, and therefore in contrast to worn-up and inferior school which came from a false conception of reality. We considered an advantage that we do not begin with doctrines, but with works that illuminate our will and from which one later derives the rules. Also, we will also introduce the new tendencies in literature at home and abroad in teaching and judging manner. We will avoid as much as possible all buzzwords that have already appeared in our literature and are capable of confusing people's minds. Despite the offensive banishment of catchwords on the one hand and the translation of arts for its own sake for l'art pour l'art, but also symbolism, which is banished to the footnote, are of course buzzwords from the French tradition, but on the other hand, they are countered by a self-created German one, geistige Kunst, spiritual art. In the modified reprint of the first issue from 1894, it is even typographically highlighted as. However, the works from which the readers are supposed to derive the rules are largely translations from French symbolism, which is thus anthologized for the German-speaking world. 140 original German language works are juxtaposed with 120 translations, mainly by George, with which the papers present themselves as administrators of European avant-garde movement. These, however, are transcriptions. George speaks of rephrases, which he accordingly regards as independent works of art and ascribes to his work. The underlying principle of their translation practice is formulated in the following: but we guarded against nothing more than a senseless mere taking over, and only brought what had become our own property through the kind of transcription which was natural and beneficial for our language, our writing, and our work in detail. This appropriation as a transfer from the original context of the work into the ornamental constellations of the Blätter für die Kunst begins with the specific motivic selection of the poems, which coincide with the ideas propagated there for spiritual southern poeticism and the aestheticization of life in and through art. It also affects the aesthetic form and semantics of the individual poems, which are simultaneously transferred in the media order of the magazine. On the one hand, through the lowercase punctuation and spelling typical of George and the visual design. On the other hand, by reinterpreting them in interaction with the original poems of George and the other collaborators through various serial constellation techniques. For example, through the resonances created by the variation of recurrent contents, catchwords, topoi, and metaphors, or the strategic arrangement of literary and programmatic contributions. For, despite the announcement to the contrary, the magazine does indeed contain such theoretical contributions in addition to works. This reinterpretation is accompanied by a nationalization at a very early stage. This already becomes clear in Klein's essay on Stefan George. Starting with Albert and Paul's description of George as poète symboliste d'Allemagne in l'Ermitage, it briefly introduces all the essential aspects that are systematically unfolded in a series of further contributions on the discussion of symbolism. As a central commonality between George and the symbolists, Klein emphasizes with a conscious or unconscious translation of Mallarmé's idea of the work of art, that it dawned on him, as it did on them, what the essence of modern poetry is, to tear the word out of its common everyday circle and to raise it into a luminous sphere. Everyone tries to do this according to the construction and laws of his language. However, he immediately traces his supposed French models back to another German tradition, stating, incidentally, the original sources of Nouvelle Poésie, almost all of its representatives make a decisive turn towards the Germanic region, lie in Germany, in German Romanticism. In Über das Formelle, on the formal, Klein later goes on to say that poetry in Germany, not even in the classical period, had ever achieved such a perfected form as French poetry had with the Parnassiens. Accordingly, the aim here should not be to destroy the form, as was the case with the young French, but first of all to achieve its classical perfection. The transfer of symbolism to the Blätter für die Kunst is thus, quote, classicist transformation. The Blätter für die Kunst subsequently gave this a special national tradition, as summarized in the anthology Deutsche Dichtung, German Poetry, which was published by their publishing house. At the same time, by appropriating translations and reinterpretations of ancient and international classics such as Plato, Dante, or Shakespeare, they ascribe a timeless and transnational quality to this genuinely German conception of the aesthetic. Later, paradoxically, this kind of transnational nationalism is linked to the idea of an aesthetic rebirth of German art and nation in the secret Germany of the George Circle, as developed by Carl August Klein in his 1910 essay Die Blätter für die Kunst und die neueste Literatur, The Papers for Art and the Latest Literature, in die Jahrbuch für die geistige Bewegung. With the paradoxical market strategies of an irregular appearance that oscillates between exclusivity and publicity, booklet and book, magazine and anthology, the international transfer of the petite revue of French symbolism and its transformation into the transnational nationalism of a timeless classic aesthetic, the Blätter für die Kunst illustrate both the paradoxical structure of modernism and the necessity of describing its leading print medium, Little Magazine, with its bibliographic, periodical, and linguistic codes in its international networks and contradictory connections to the mass media print market of the time in a differentiated way. Thank you for listening and thinking along.